Good evening, everyone, and welcome to WBUR's virtual town hall. I'm Anthony Brooks, WBUR senior political reporter, and tonight we're going to be discussing the upcoming presidential election and how the COVID-19 pandemic, the current economic crisis, and the racial justice movement are all having a dramatic impact on the race. This is the latest in a series of town halls that we are hosting on important subjects, and you can subscribe to the WBUR YouTube channel to get notified anytime we release a new video. You can also click the bell icon right next to the subscribe button if you want to be notified whenever we go live. So tonight we're going to take on many facets of this conversation, including President Trump's response to COVID-19, how's Joe Biden doing and what he still has to do to credibly challenge the president, and how has the movement for racial justice and the Black Lives Matter protests over police killings shifted the current political moment. We've got a great panel tonight. Two of our guests have their fingers on the political pulse. Actually, all three have their fingers on the political pulse, including my colleague, Kimberly Atkins, WBUR senior news correspondent. She joins us from Washington. Also with us, conservative political analyst Shermichael Singleton and Democratic political consultant and CBS News political contributor Joel Payne. Welcome to you all. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, so before we get started, I want to just tell our viewers, our listeners, to keep in mind that this is a town hall. It's a discussion with all of you. So we want you to join the conversation. Here's how you do it. You can submit your questions on slido.com. The event code is WBUR-VTH11. That's WBUR Victor Tango Hotel 11. We already have some great questions, so please keep them coming, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. You can also go to the YouTube live chat and talk to others who are watching and exchanging ideas. So, folks, friends, I'd like to start with a brief question for all of you about where you think this presidential contest stands right now. President Trump appears to be caught in a bit of a crossfire of events and seems to be struggling with a cogent response. The pandemic continues to cause record rates of infection in at least a dozen states. Tens of millions of Americans are out of work, and much of America is focused on a racial justice movement that the president responds to as a law and order issue. Meanwhile, his restart in Tulsa last weekend was a bit of a dud. The Supreme Court defied him on LGBTQ rights and on the Dreamers in two major decisions last week. And his poll numbers have cratered, not just nationally, but in many swing states. So, Kimberly, I want to start with you. How do you sum up the state of the presidential contest with less than 5 months to go to Election Day?
Yeah, at this moment in time, it really seems that President Trump is probably at his worst political moment of his term so far. I mean, we've seen him face any number of crises, both domestically and foreign over the past 3.5 years. And then we emerge from it and take a look at the poll numbers once the dust clears. And he's largely, especially within his base, at the exact same spot and with very, very high approval numbers among all Republicans. And time and time again, he seems to have, he withstands the storm. This time feels different. We are, as you pointed out, seeing a consistent trajectory of a drop in his polling numbers. We are seeing him much less not having that campaign apparatus to go to and throwing rallies. He's been largely stuck in DC. He's stuck in our homes like the rest of us during the pandemic. And also the response to that pandemic he's been getting low marks for that. And also he seems out of step with the place that the country is in with this reckoning on racial justice. So it's really the perfect political storm. There's still 4 months left. I mean, just think about how long ago the impeachment was, and that was just a couple months ago. We are in no place to make any predictions, but at this moment, it's not a good political one for the president.
Right. Shermichael, let me come to you. Same question, a quick sort of sum it up for us, what you see out there in terms of the state of this race.
And I think one of the primary concerns should be for the president and Republicans alike, whether or not Republicans can maintain control of the Senate. From conversations that I have had with several former colleagues who now work for various members on the House and Senate side. There is legitimate concern among leadership that there are now more Republican senators vulnerable come November. And so the question for many of them is, can you separate yourself from the president? Is that too risky, or do you double down in hopes of turning out and maximizing that Republican base? That's a question that many of them do not have yet. As of a week ago, the president met with Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to talk about that very real issue. I also think that if you look at the momentum that's building on the other side, there was a lot of questions early on about Joe Biden among many Democrats. And I think at this point in time, because of the lackadaisical response from the federal government as it pertains to COVID-19, I think because of the president's struggle and inability to coalesce and bring the country together around race and criminal justice, I think now we're beginning to see more debates and discussions about statues. The president, once again, hasn't seemed to be able to find the proper balance, again, on this topic. And so I think you're seeing many individuals who are not in that Republican base who may have been somewhat skeptical or hesitant about Joe Biden maybe 2 or 3 months ago, who are now saying absolutely not, by any means necessary. We must turn out to vote and get this guy out of office. And that should be a concern for President Trump, Anthony, because as we know, he has a cap of around 37, 36, 38%. There hasn't been any statistical analysis that would lead me to believe that he's able to move beyond that. And so the benefit of that for Joe Biden is that if he can maximize a Democratic turnout in key swing states, as Kimberly has pointed out, data is beginning to suggest that he likely can, although again, it's still early. I think this is going to be a very challenging 4 months for the president. And the idea that it's guaranteed for him, as some of his supporters have alluded to, I would say be careful with that expectation.
So, Joel, I want to come to you. I mean, Kimberly made the important point that 4 months is sort of a lifetime in politics. So a lot can happen. And we want to stress that sort of the current numbers in the polls that we're seeing are just that. They're a snapshot of the moment. But what are you seeing? I mean, it sounds like, it seems like it's fair to say this is an uphill climb right now for the president.
Yeah, Anthony, I mean, look, 4 months is a long time. 4 months ago, we would have been having a conversation about impeachment. And that seems like the furthest thing from anybody's mind right now. So that is important. Also, I may have some PTSD from my time on the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, where 4 weeks before the election, we thought it was going to be a different outcome. So 4 months is a really long time. If this is a football game, it's the first quarter. All that said, Donald Trump is the ultimate unconventional politician. But so far, all he is presenting are very kind of conventional tactics to win re-election. He has not evolved. He's not transformed as a candidate. He hasn't changed his message and he hasn't changed his pitch. And I think what we're seeing is that voters are looking for, what else do you have to say? Do you have a second note that you can play? Like, look at the past three, national presidential elections. Barack Obama ran a different campaign in 2012 than he did in 2008. He talked about reducing federal spending. He brought in moderates into his White House. George Bush ran completely differently in 2004 than he ran in 2000. Ronald Reagan, even in his second term, ran different in 1984 than 1980. What is Trump's, second pitch? I don't think we've seen that. And I think that's why so far it's a referendum on Donald Trump. And normally that'd be something that would be very troubling for a challenger like Joe Biden. I don't think the Biden campaign is troubled by that referendum choice at the moment. And the challenge for Trump is to take the attention and the pressure off of him to demonstrate he should be president and start to prosecute and execute a case against why Joe Biden wouldn't be a good president. And his team can't get out of their own way to do that.
Well, the theme of this talk is how the coronavirus and the pandemic is affecting the presidential race, and we're going to get to that. But I just want to set the scene a little more and take a look at how a lot of this is reflected in some recent polling. We've got two slides from Real Clear Politics, and the first is a roundup of national polling. And can we take a look at that, folks? Because I just want to give a sense of these numbers. They're quite dramatic, and they tell a pretty consistent story. So you can see here are polling numbers from Fox News, from Quinnipiac, from YouGov, CNBC, CNN, NPR, PBS, Marist. And, they range from Biden with a 10-point lead right up to a 14-point lead from the NPR, PBS, Marist poll. Or is that a CNN poll? I'm having trouble reading it. Anyway, that's the range. And then, so as we all know, elections aren't won by a national vote. It's state by state. So let's take a look at the state-by-state poll in three key battleground states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Again, this is the real clear politics. And again, you're looking at a range of numbers there, with Biden up by as much as, I think, 12% in Michigan. He's up by as much as 9% in Wisconsin and 8% in Pennsylvania. Now, stress again and again, these are polls, a snapshot in a moment of a moment. But here's my question. This all represents a pretty good position for Joe Biden. But to what extent is Biden's advantage in this moment actually due to him? In other words, he's been largely out of sight for some time because of the pandemic. And I'd argue that the current dynamic in the race has been mostly dictated by the president's missteps as opposed to Biden's positive steps. Kimberly, what do you think?
I think that's exactly right. Look, when the pandemic hit and we started shutting things down and staying in our homes, the first thing I thought, using conventional political wisdom, which is a tricky thing to do in 2020, was that this is devastating for the Biden campaign, because Donald Trump still has the podium. He still has the White House from which to campaign. And he always treats every official White House event and appearance as much as a campaign event as an official one. So I just thought, what is Joe Biden going to do? There was constant coverage of the pandemic. If he wanted to get out on the airways, in video from his home, nobody was paying attention to it. And I thought that it would be really devastating. And the absolute opposite happened. This has become a referendum, a straight referendum for the past couple of months until the death of George Floyd. It became a referendum on President Trump's response to the pandemic. And Joe Biden was able to completely benefit from that without doing much of anything. He gave a few speeches, he looked presidential, and that was all he really needed to do. Now, as the constant attention to the coronavirus and the White House response has sort of faded, now it's time for the Biden campaign to figure out what it does next. And I can't get a clear picture of what that is yet. But at this point, they have to go off defense and onto offense and really start making the case in order to convince folks in states like Michigan, in states like Wisconsin. I always go back to the sage wisdom of Larry Sabato at University of Virginia. Every election, national elections are won on the margins. Those are the places where these margins are. Places like that, even places like Arizona, red states that are getting more purple, and really make the case to a broad range of folks. It's harder for the Democratic nominee. It's harder for Biden. He has to make the case not only to the working class folks and the suburbanites, which made such a big difference in the 2016 election, but also really encourage people of color to get out and vote, Latinx voters, Black voters, new voters, first-generation Americans. So it's a tougher pitch to make, and he's got limited time and even limited ability by not being able to go to events. He's been having events, socially distanced events, but it's just a lot tougher now. So the next several months will be crucial for Biden.
So, Joel, what does Biden have to do in these next several months? I mean, the cynic could say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Maybe he should just stay in his basement and let Trump continue to beat up on Trump. But I mean, seriously, as a political advisor and consultant, what do you have the vice president do in the next, I guess, 2 or 3, several weeks to start getting his message out there?
Well, I'll answer that, but something just going back to those poll numbers that you showed, and I think Kim was touching on this a bit. The numbers that I would look at are those numbers that start with a 5, which means that he's over 50% or he's at 50% in a lot of those polls in a lot of those states. That's a key number. If you see like 47 to 43, that means there's still a lot of undecided voters. When you start to see those numbers routinely clip above 50%, That means that attitudes have kind of begun to settle in. That doesn't mean that the numbers can't move, but it just means that a higher percentage of voters have started to make up their minds. And I do think that when you're talking about an election around the margins like this, I think that it's very important. By the way, I'd be curious to see what the numbers look like if you do favorability, which is even more important, I think, than the bottom line preference choice right now, because favorability suggests the ceiling that each of the candidates have. And Joe Biden has a higher favorability and predictably a higher ceiling than Donald Trump, but also more importantly than what Hillary Clinton had 4 years ago. So those are things to kind of think about with those numbers. In terms of the Biden strategy, a lot of people have been kind of wondering what Biden is going to do at this moment where he's kind of been restricted for, what type of campaigning he can do. I think it's been a godsend for the Biden campaign. A couple of things. One, the Biden campaign was not particularly that impressive in the primary season. They had a lot of turnover. There's a new campaign manager. There are new senior people at the helm of that campaign. They've really retooled. They've kind of quietly been able to do that in this period that we've been quarantined. And so I actually think they needed the time. I also think, frankly, the candidate probably needed the time a bit to get his sea legs under him and start to think about how he wanted to prosecute a case to the electorate. So I think that this has been actually very fortunate for the Biden campaign to have this time to think. I think the next big flashpoint you will probably see is whoever Joe Biden picks as his vice president, which I know we'll have a longer discussion about that shortly. But I think that will tell you the kind of campaign he will run. If he picks a low risk candidate, it means that Biden is going to continue to run a risk averse campaign. If he picks somebody that's maybe different or newer voice, that means that Biden wants to shake it up. So those are things to watch.
So we're going to, as you mentioned, Joel, we're going to talk in a little bit about the vice presidential pick, because obviously that's a huge moment for the Biden campaign. I just want to tell our viewers that I'm Anthony Brooks, and this is a WBUR Town Hall. We're talking about the 2020 elections and the impact of the pandemic, the economic crisis, and the growing movement for racial justice on the race for the White House. If you're just joining us, we're live streaming with WBUR senior news correspondent Kimberly Atkins, conservative political analyst Shermichael Singleton, and CBS News political contributor Joel Payne. You can join the conversation, submit your questions to us by going to slido.com, and you can use the event code WBURVTH11. Shermichael, I want to come to you, because if Biden is in sort of as good a position he's in, looking at a lot of these recent polling numbers, I think you put your finger on this earlier on, Trump's got his base, but some of those key constituencies that he did very well with in 2016, suburban women, for example, women without college education, and older voters, all seem to be leaving him to a certain extent. What's his strategy to try to get those folks back and move beyond his base?
I think it's interesting when you think about the suburbs and you look at the 2018 exit results. Republicans lost the suburbs. I think if you look at the Democratic primary process and you look at Biden's overall performance and you compare his performance not necessarily to Hillary Clinton's, but to Barack Obama's, there's a lot of similarities. Biden was maybe off 2-3 percentage points in certain states and congressional districts when you really extrapolate the data, which I think that's impressive. I also think we have to keep in mind of how demography has changed the suburbs. The suburbs today is not the suburbs that existed when even Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012 and Republicans before then. And so I think that's something you have to consider. The suburbs now is a lot of younger but older millennials, individuals around 36, 37, who's just starting a family. Those individuals, I would argue, based on exit results that we have seen thus far, lean more towards a Democratic type candidate and not necessarily one like a President Trump. You talk about older voters. I think a lot of older voters are starting to become primarily concerned with the future for their children and their grandchildren. And I think when you look at President Trump's overall theme and message, it's been one that's been more so reactionary and not more forward thinking, which is why I think some individuals on the left have sort of attempted to push Vice President Biden to craft a message that's more forward thinking about what people can expect about the future. And I think that's something where, as Joel sort of mentioned, a potential running mate that will be intriguing, because whomever he selects, I would argue, will give some type of an indication of that. Now, to answer your overall question, Anthony, about the president, I just don't see for President Trump an ability or an area to really pull more from outside of those individuals who are hardcore, ardent Trump supporters. And I think perhaps the wish could be that once this stuff sort of clears up, meaning COVID-19, and we can really start seeing campaigning again, they may hope that once Biden gets back out there and he sort of starts talking off the cuff, maybe you'll see some of that enthusiasm decrease some. I think that's the only hope. But I really do believe if you look at a lot of data, and I don't just mean these snapshot polls, I mean, look at the primary results and you compare those results to President Obama, you will see similarities. You can look at Hillary Clinton and compare it to Vice President Biden, and you will see Biden overperforming in areas where Hillary Clinton performed many years before. And so when I look at all of those markers, I am convinced that the vice president does have a slight advantage. That is not to say that those things can't change. But I just don't see how they change enough 4 months from now for the president to be able to expand that base with some of those individuals who weren't necessarily traditional Republican voters, but people who sort of crossed over. I don't think you may see some of those folks cross over again, Anthony, in November. Again, I could be wrong, but looking at the data that we have presently available, it appears that those voters have sort of transferred back over to the Democratic side.
Well, I want to talk specifically about the current crisis, the pandemic, and what kind of impact this is having on the race. So let me put up a slide on the latest numbers there. This is from NPR. And do we have that slide, folks? I think it's coming up shortly. There it is. So this is just the kind of state of the pandemic. There's some key numbers there. 2 million cases, more than. And that number is climbing, more than 120,000 deaths and growing. And meanwhile, to return to those polls, a majority of Americans are really disappointed with the way the president has been handling this pandemic and responding to it. A number of polls suggest that. So I just want to talk about how this has scrambled the race, because not long ago, President Trump was counting on basing his reelection campaign on a strong economy. Joe Biden was presenting himself as a kind of restoration candidate. Now that's completely scrambled, and a lot of the new dynamic is being driven by the pandemic. Not to mention these protests across the country, and a growing movement around racial justice. So I want to talk about how these two candidates have responded to that. First, President Trump, as we heard in Tulsa last weekend, and as he's made clear a number of times, wants to run as sort of the law and order candidate. I'll stick with you, Shermichael, as the conservative voice here. Can he do that? I mean, is that a credible route for the president to take?
I mean, that's really interesting, because I think when you look at a lot of vandalism and looting, I do believe that there are a certain sector of voters, independent swing voters, that may lean right or left, who are somewhat older, who are white, maybe even college educated, business owners, et cetera, who will see some of those things on television, read them in papers, listen to them on the radio, and are rightfully so concerned. And so I think for the president to articulate a message of we need to sort of restore some level of civility amidst this chaos. Yes, we should address the problems. Yes, the grievances are indeed legitimate, but we have to have order through this. I think that does have some resonance or appeal. The problem is, Anthony, his articulation of what I just stated hasn't been the case. There have more so been dog whistles that have been apparent racist, tinged, I think most individuals would argue and agree to. And so I think this is an ample opportunity for former Vice President Biden to speak directly to the heart of these issues, to speak of a message that unites the country, that brings the country together, and articulates a path where you can see us addressing these issues through the policy level, not only federally, but in a speech he just gave, he also spoke about this issue locally with mayors and city managers, a real solution-oriented sort of concrete plan that I think voters actually would like to see versus the overall idea of law and order, because law and order doesn't necessarily address the problems. They don't necessarily meet the grievances where they are. And I think there is a growing and expansive percent of voters, Anthony, that want to see solutions oriented coming from these candidates. And I think the president, for the most part, has been able to get away with sort of speaking in hyperbole about things without offering specificity. I don't think that's going to work going into November.
Right. Joel, same theme to you. I mean, what I find ironic about the idea of Trump running as the law and order candidate is that he has, up until this point, he's someone who has thrived in chaos. I mean, he creates chaos. And I recall Jeb Bush in 2015 saying that if he were to be elected president, he'd be the chaos president. And in a way, that's worked for him in the past because it allows him to sort of change the channel when it's necessary. But do you get the sense that the chaos around him now is working against him?
Well, it's interesting because Trump likes to, I think, draw parallels between his situation right now and Richard Nixon in 1968, right? And I think that's the easy, kind of lazy historical parallel. Here's the difference. Nixon wasn't in the White House. This is a mess of Donald Trump's making. He's the president. He's the incumbent. So if people are voting for, hey, we need radical change, we need to shift who's the leadership, it means he's leaving. It doesn't mean he's being put in place to stop something. So I do think that challenger incumbent parallel is important to consider. And look, the graph that you showed talked about COVID. I think you also have to factor in the twin crises of COVID and the racial unrest in the country. And Trump has not been able to bring the country together at this moment. And in fact, what he's done is he's alienated a lot of folks, not, by the way, just African Americans who might feel most personally passionate about this, but he's alienated a lot of white independents and moderates because those folks in the middle don't want to be seen as being on the wrong side of history. And I think that that's an emerging dynamic that we're going to see through this race, is that there are a lot of people in the middle, people in the past who may have just kind of been silent and observing and watching and not really engaged. I think now the jerseys have to be worn. People have to choose a side. There's no room to be in the middle anymore. And so I think that is hurting the president because he is forced a clarifying decision. And many Americans, particularly those white independents and moderates, are forced to make a clarifying choice. And right now, again, it's 4 months away, but right now it appears that the choice that they're making is to stand with the people demanding change, not stand with the people who are protecting an apparently broken system.
So Kimberly,
Anthony, can I make a point off of that? One thing that this pandemic has definitely done, I think, to Joel's point, is it's focused the Americans' attention on what Donald Trump is doing. For 3 years, reporters like me have talked to folks and asked them, well, what do you think about what the president is saying, what he's doing, what he's tweeting? And it's very easy for particularly his supporters to say, oh, well, I don't pay attention to all that. I don't like it, but I don't pay attention to all that. I think he's doing a good job. Well, the pandemic has many Americans in their homes. They are focused on this. They are looking specifically at the response because they're worried about their paychecks. They're worried about their health care. They're worried about their families. For those who are even well off and can withstand the impact of this, there's no sports. There's no new television. They are focused on this and they are seeing what the president is doing and paying close attention. They can't not pay close attention. And so we are seeing a reaction to that. I think that's one reason that we have seen a different response to the Black Lives Matter movement today than what we saw a few years back when it first started and it was largely marginalized and pushed aside as some sort of fringe effort. That's one reason why when everyone saw that video of George Floyd, everyone was universally appalled. That is one impact of this pandemic that has been really working against the president. And the other, of course, we haven't talked about it yet, is the economy. The economy tanked. The president thought he would be running for re-election on the economy. And when that went away, he had his campaign message, which we haven't heard already, keep America great. Well, America is not great right now, so he can't say that. He has to keep saying that he's going to make America great again. And that just belies the argument that he has done a good job. So there are a lot of ways that the pandemic has come. And also, and to Shermichael's point about the Senate and how this resonates with other Republicans, one fact that I saw this week that I thought was fascinating, that in the last 2 months, the poverty level actually decreased. And that was due because of the stimulus that was passed by Congress and the president that boosted unemployment benefits and gave Americans that one-time $1,200 payment. That not only kept Americans afloat, that actually lifted the poverty level a bit. And so it makes it really hard for conservative-minded, fiscally responsible Republicans to make the case that, hey, we need to get rid of these entitlement programs, because entitlement programs really held America together in the last several months. Now, for President Trump, if you wanted to, you could say, that's right, I did that. He could claim responsibility. He signed that bill, and he can sort of branch out as an independent and say, I will always take care of you in the bad times, so stick with me. But he's not. He's retreating into these same sort of grievance-based fights that got him to victory in 2016, going toward his instincts, and his instincts seem to be failing him.
We've got a question. We've got actually several questions on Slido, and I want to go to a couple. Again, you can go to slido.com and pose your question to us here right now. Slido.com, you can join the conversation by submitting your question and using the event code WBURVTH11. Here's one from John. And Shermichael, I feel like this is a question for you, because I think you were speaking to this issue just a moment ago. Do you think moderate Republicans are beginning to look for a candidate who speaks in terms of policy as opposed to rhetoric, like Donald Trump?
No, I think so. And there's some data that suggests that there are a percent of moderate Republicans out there in the suburbs, the more corporate type, more small business owners, who actually would consider voting for a Joe Biden, depending on who his running mate is. I would like to look at more data to sort of back that, but I have seen some initial analytics and reports that suggest that might actually be a legitimate thing come November. Look, I think if you're a conservative and you're looking at the way President Trump has governed, I just don't see how you can't be concerned. If the idea of conservatism is to respect norms, to preserve order, to preserve institutions, if the idea of conservatism is to have limits on a federal government that seems to act recklessly without any level of transparency, then it's kind of difficult to look at what we've seen thus far and say this lines up with each of those idealistical truths that conservatives have purported for so long to believe in. And so I do think someone like a Vice President Biden, who I personally have seen as someone who's more of a moderate-leaning Democrat, I think that is someone with the right message could attract some of those more moderate Republicans who may have voted for Trump because they didn't like Hillary Clinton, or they liked his message on the economy, they liked his message on deregulation, who may say, yes, I love all of those things. And if Joe Biden can speak to some of those things while bringing back some level of normalcy, while not tearing down our institutions, while not lowering the respect that we ought to have for the office, then I could see myself voting for him. I think that there are some moderate Republicans out there who do have those beliefs, who Joe Biden could indeed attract.
I want to talk a little more about Joe Biden and in particular his response to the racial justice movement that's going on across the country, indeed around the world. And the story is complicated for Biden because in a real way, he's going to be the Democratic nominee thanks largely to African-American voters. I mean, let's not forget that his campaign was the walking dead until the South Carolina primary, which lifted him back into contention, and then votes across the South, mainly by black voters who essentially turned his campaign around. At the same time, he's got this complicated legacy as one of the architects of the 1994 crime bill, which many critics say resulted into far too many African Americans being incarcerated over far too long, among other problems. So, Joel, in that sense, is Biden the right messenger for this time? Or, are people, I mean, it seems like enough voters are capable of saying, hey, that was a long time ago. He's a different guy now. Maybe he can match the current moment.
Anthony, he is the messenger.
Yeah.
We'll see if he's the right one. Look, to answer your question a little bit more thoroughly, I think Joe Biden has obviously found himself in this position, like you said, because of African-American voters, particularly older, more female African-American voters in the South, who decided, okay, Donald Trump's presidency is an existential crisis. Joe Biden is the person that can beat him. He's the only candidate that I believe can beat him. That's why we're going to support Biden. What you have to realize is the folks who've been out in the streets for the last month, who are the ones who are crying out for change, yes, spiritually, a lot of those African Americans who rescued Biden are with those folks. But the folks who are out in the streets who don't like the system are younger. They are voters who don't believe in institutional remedies. And by the way, that includes Joe Biden. So I don't think it's quite as simple as assuming that the million or so people that we've seen milling around the streets, protesting peacefully, some doing more than that. I don't think it's wise to assume that those folks are like automatically going to register to vote specifically to vote for Joe Biden. I think that those folks don't trust anybody in the system, and that includes Joe Biden. And so Biden needs a persuasion strategy to bring those folks on board. Now, he's taken some very important steps. He surrounded himself with good people like Karine Jean-Pierre, who I've worked with, who's a very noted Democratic strategist and Obama campaign veteran. He's already got Simone Sanders, who's a Sanders campaign veteran from 2016. So he's got some good people around him, smart people who understand how to reach out to this community that feels lost and feels misunderstood. But Biden has to talk directly to that community without feeling like he is pandering to that community. And that's for a politician like Joe Biden, who has made his career around kind of some of the conventional old ways of politics, that is going to be a challenge. And I think really right now for Donald Trump, the best thing he can do is try to deflate those voters from showing up by either making them think that Biden is not their champion or by making it harder for them to vote. And so I think that's the interplay that we're seeing play out right in front of us. There's a big primary in Kentucky and New York tonight. There was a primary a couple of weeks ago in a place like Wisconsin where people had to wait on long lines, in Georgia last week where people had to wait on long lines. So that's where you see those issues of voter disenfranchisement because of difficulty voting come to light.
Interesting, because on that very question, Joel, we've got a Slido question from Dan. Are any of you nervous about low voter turnout due to fears around the pandemic? You could also expand that question, include issues around voter intimidation and voter suppression and so on and so forth. But Kimberly, take a crack at that. What do you think?
Yeah, well, one thing that we did not see that was a part of the response to the coronavirus out of Congress was efforts to boost voter protection or expand ways that voters can vote. That was something that states were left on their own to do. It was hard enough to ensure that voting systems were secure and budget for that. And then they had this increased pressure in figuring out how to run elections in the middle of a pandemic, worrying about everything from, like in Wisconsin during that primary, we saw a direct spike in coronavirus infection rates after that, to how to get out, how to do mail balloting and changing the criteria for who qualifies to be able to do mail balloting, all, by the way, while the president is using his bully pulpit to claim that mail voting is fraudulent in some ways, even though he himself voted by mail in his now resident state of Florida. So it is a big issue. We're seeing states take any number of measures. It's actually also a primary day in Virginia. You don't hear much about it because a lot of the primaries were canceled if there was an uncontested race. So folks like the Senator Warner is not contested on the Democratic side, so that primary was essentially canceled. And there are some challenges to other states that have canceled primaries without a challenger, because if you think about it, people have the right to go write someone in, but states are doing the best that they can. And we saw long lines in Georgia where people were standing and waiting hours. A lot of elderly people, a lot of communities of color. It's a big problem, and it raised a lot of red flags as to what might happen in November. And that's saying nothing of potential efforts to actually suppress the vote and intimidate voters. So it's a big problem. I think it's not necessarily going to affect turnout, but it could lay the groundwork if Election Day is a mess. For the results to be challenged, whether in a genuine way or a very disingenuous way. So states should be doing everything they possibly can to instill confidence among voters that the vote that they'll be able to submit their ballots, and that the ballots they submit will be counted and treated as valid.
Anthony, can I jump in really quickly?
Of course you can, Joel.
one thing on voting, I actually feel really good as a Democrat about the energy on the Democratic side. If you go back to the Democratic primary and you look at the states between Iowa and New Hampshire, where obviously WBUR is, and Nevada and South Carolina, all record turnouts in those states. That tells you that Democratic energy is high, that Democrats are excited about the idea of voting for somebody to get this president out of office. And I don't think that should be lost. There are a lot of challenges, and I think Kim outlined them brilliantly a moment ago, but Democratic energy is very high. The fundraising numbers are high. That's another thermometer indicator of energy and of excitement on the Democratic side. And again, that turnout was, every week during those primaries, we saw record numbers being toppled. So that's important to elevate as well.
Yeah, interesting. On the other hand, we're learning from polls that while Biden certainly holds an advantage now, the average Trump supporter is a lot more excited about Trump than the average Biden supporter is for Biden. Does that represent an opportunity, Shermichael, for President Trump?
I think it does. One thing is so reliable about Trump voters is that they will turn out and support the president no matter what. And I think that's a concern that Democrats should have come November. Joel and Kimberly have both sort of alluded to and laid this out, that if we do find ourselves in November in the midst of a return, if you will, of COVID-19 combined with influenza, that could be a deadly combination. And I think if you're a Democrat and you're concerned about turning out your base, African Americans, who we know for a fact have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 because of underlying health conditions and a plethora of other health reasons, that is something that obviously benefits Donald Trump because his voters will turn out hell or high water. And so I think what Democrats have to do is begin the process of working with African Americans, working with other key constituents in those key battleground states to make sure that people complete the necessary documentation to fill out absentee balloting as soon as possible. That would be my advice if I was working for the Democratic side. However, the benefit, again, for the president is that if we find ourselves again in a chaotic moment, it obviously benefits him. I think you're going to see some Republican states that are ran by governors that have Republican Secretary of States are going to likely position themselves to make it a lot more challenging for individuals to request those ballots. We're already beginning to see that, as Joel just laid out. I do think that you're going to see some Democratic-leaning organizations contest those things in the court. So I think come November, this could be a really tricky situation where if it is so close, Anthony, I do believe you could have both sides contesting this going all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Wow. I want to just remind.
I hope not. I hope not.
Let's hope not. But it's possible, and of course we've been there not long ago. I do want to remind our viewers, I'm Anthony Brooks. This is a WBUR Town Hall. We're talking about the 2020 elections and the impact of the pandemic, the economic crisis, and the growing movement for racial justice on the election. If you're just joining us, we're live streaming with WBUR senior news correspondent Kimberly Atkins, conservative political analyst Shermichael Singleton, and CBS News political contributor Joel Payne. And we want to invite you to be a part of this conversation. You can submit your questions by going to slido.com and using the event code WBURVTH11. I want to be sure we've got plenty of time to talk about the vice presidential pick, Biden's vice presidential pick, because it's such an important, and I think to political junkies like I dare say all of us, it's a fun story to talk about as well. We understand he'll be making a decision in the early days of August. He said he wants to pick a female running mate. As we mentioned, the fact that he will be the nominee is due in a very big way to African-American voters. And given the current moment around calls for racial justice, do you think he has to pick a woman of color? Joel, let me start with you there.
Has to is a tough word here. I think it's a should.
Yeah.
I think if Joe Biden picked a non-woman of color, I think there's still a path to victory. I think it's just harder. And I think
you mean a woman, a white woman, a white woman. Yeah.
A white woman is, woman of color gets loaded. Michelle Lujan Grisham is of Hispanic descent. She's the governor of New Mexico. There are folks like that, Catherine Cortez Masto, et cetera. But a black woman we're talking about.
Right.
It's possible Donald Trump could win without a black female running mate. but I think it's just rather Joe Biden, sorry, without a black female runner. I think it's just a little bit harder. So I think Biden, as you mentioned, owes really his presidential candidacy right now to black voters. And so I think that that's first and foremost. I think secondly, the moment that we're in, I think it's hard to suggest that there is a better candidate than the very highly qualified African-American women who are being considered by the Biden campaign. If you're telling me that Kamala Harris is not more qualified than Gretchen Whitmer or is not more qualified than Elizabeth Warren, what are you really saying? And I do think that there's an implicit message there that the Biden campaign will certainly want to be careful about. I think the real decision point for the Biden campaign is the type of candidate from that pool of very qualified African-American women that they will have to choose from. Is it going to be somebody who is a little bit more high name ID to the public, someone who most people already know, like a Kamala Harris, like a Susan Rice, who's a former diplomat in the Obama administration? Or is it going to be a newer face like a Keisha Lance Bottoms or a Stacey Abrams, who's probably in the middle there in terms of name ID? Or, a Val Demings, the congresswoman from Florida. Is it going to be a newer voice or is it going to be a voice that's more familiar? If it's a newer voice, again, that suggests to me that the Biden campaign feels like they need a jolt of energy and they need to shake things up and they need to have someone that they can tell a story around. If it's a voice that is already pretty well known, that means they're pretty well vetted. That means they can be an elite surrogate on TV. That means that they can go to a place like Michigan or Wisconsin or Arizona and gin up Democratic enthusiasm. That means that you're playing it a little bit closer to the vest and it's a lower risk choice. And I think Biden has demonstrated he's running a risk averse campaign up until now. I think if the race is in the same place as it is now, as it is in a month when he's predictably going to make that choice, I think you'll probably see somebody who's got a higher name ID already, someone like a Kamala Harris, someone like a Susan Rice.
Is there an argument, and this is where politics can get sort of cynical, surprise, surprise, not to pick an African-American female running mate? In other words, as the primaries proved, Biden has a lot of support among black voters. And some might argue that what he needs to shore up is support among working class voters in the middle of the country, which might be an argument for, a Midwestern governor like Gretchen Whitmer, for example. That's the sort of cynical political calculation, but I'll stick with you on that, Joel. What about that argument that, think about the sort of middle of America? That's where Biden really needs to shore up his support.
Well, there's two things I would throw back to you. One, there's a lot of black voters in the middle of America.
Yeah.
You look at Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I know this again very well because I worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign. One of the reasons Hillary Clinton lost Wisconsin is because black voters in Milwaukee did not show up. You could say the same thing for, and I know Kim is very near and dear to Michigan. I know there are a lot of voters in Wayne County, Michigan, a lot of African-American voters who didn't show up. So I don't think we can preclude that picking an African-American woman makes it harder to appeal to African-American voters in those places who can be swing voters, who can tip elections. I think that's important to consider as well. I will say this, though, Anthony, I do see a bit of a split between what I call like elite Democrats, like people, frankly, like myself, people who've worked on campaigns, who go on TV, and like rank and file Democrats, people who just kind of pay attention around Election Day. African Americans who maybe aren't swimming in this all the time, who I've talked to have said, if Joe Biden decides it's better for him to appeal to more voters to pick a non-African American woman, then that's not going to be a non-starter for them. And I do think that reflects a little bit of a divide between, again, the kind of like governing ruling class of the Democratic Party and like rank and file voters. And that does say something interesting. Picking an African-American person would be a jolt for kind of those grass tops leaders, as opposed to the grassroots leaders who, again, really just want to beat Donald Trump. That's all they care about. If you tell them that person X, no matter what their background is, will help them beat Donald Trump, that's what they want to do to beat Donald Trump. So that's important to consider as well.
And can I jump in on that? Can that very point it was before the protests really took over the consciousness of the country in the way that it has. But I want to point folks to from a few weeks back, a Morning Consult poll on the VP choices, and it found that the broadest support, including support from Black voters, the broadest support among age ranges and geography, was Elizabeth Warren. So it's not as a straightforward of decision as it might be painted, Black or not Black, and the consideration may be a bit broader than we're representing here. Also, I will say, although I think this year is a little different, I still think one thing is true. Folks like us make way more out of the VP pick than voters do. It is fun to talk about. Voters really don't care that much.
I know that's true, but I have this gut feeling that this year is different. But
it is different. They'll care more, but they still won't care as much as we do.
Yeah, that's probably true. But Kimberly, I'm glad you brought up that Morning Consult poll and the point about Elizabeth Warren. I want to ask you this question. So Amy Klobuchar pulled herself out of the running and basically told Joe Biden, you need to pick a woman of color to be your running mate. In some way, did that lessen the chances of an Elizabeth Warren pick?
Well, I mean, it was seen, whether intended or not, as a bit of shade, but I don't think so. I mean, look, Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren appealed to different folks in the primary. And Amy Klobuchar was someone who represented this idea that she's Midwestern and she can bring in moderates and she can sort of be a unifier. And then the moment in America changed, where it doesn't seem that Democrats and folks even in the moderate category are interested in safe. They're seeing how this virus has really impacted the country, and that's still heading in the bad direction. They're seeing these calls for social justice, and Amy Klobuchar just seemed very much out of step with that in a way that the other people who are remaining in this are not. Look, I think at this point, especially to the point that was made that the field of potential vice presidential picks is so strong and is full of people that are so qualified, the biggest potential roadblock for Joe Biden is to look like it was a pander. And in this case, given the people who are on this list, nobody looks like a pander or someone who's just trying to appeal to Black people and giving lip service. These are all people who have strong resumes and will bring specific things to the office if they're chosen.
So I'm going to read a comment, anonymous, that came in on Slido. As a Black woman, I'd have issues voting for Kamala Harris because of her actions as Attorney General of California. She's also not progressive enough to bring over the Bernie voters. So that comment from Anonymous on Slido. Shermichael, we haven't heard you on the sort of vice presidential pick for Joe Biden. What are you thinking?
You know, I mean, Democrats are going to have to figure this out. I don't necessarily associate with the Republican Party anymore, just because I just think the party is going in a direction that is so far removed from my personal conservative beliefs. But with that said, I do think that Vice President Biden, as Kim alluded to, has a balancing act, unlike one that President Trump has to worry about. His voters are primarily white. Joe Biden has African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, white Americans, young Americans, old Americans, progressive, centrist Democrats. I mean, his ability to appeal to a broad spectrum of the American voter population is going to be challenging. And so I think in selecting a running mate, you need someone that at least has enough appeal to, I would argue, pull in some of those progressives. I think Joe Biden, again, as I stated, when I see him as a more centrist-leaning, moderate-leaning Democrat, I think he will do well with older African Americans. He will do well with older white Americans. But I think you need someone who can energize and pull in some of those younger, more progressive, more energetic and excited voters who supported someone like an Elizabeth Warren, or maybe someone who supported a Bernie Sanders. And I'm not necessarily sure that Kamala Harris is the person to do that. Perhaps, as Kim stated, it is someone like an Elizabeth Warren. I'm not certain that African-American voters care as much about the race of the running mate as much as they are concerned about defeating Donald Trump. And I think, as Joel stated, the overwhelming majority will look at the ticket and say, if this is the best ticket to replace this guy, then we're going to stick with Joe Biden no matter what. And so I think that's something that the Biden camp has to keep in mind as they go through the pool of potential individuals to select.
Anthony, can I just jump real quickly? Two things. One, on the Klobuchar piece, I say this with all due respect to the senior senator from Minnesota. Amy Klobuchar made that comment because I think it was pretty clear she wasn't going to be the nominee. So, benevolence included. I think Amy Klobuchar was doing her politics there, and that's totally fine. But if Amy Klobuchar was still a prime candidate for the vice presidency, I don't think we would have seen that dramatic announcement that we saw within the last week. So that's one. And I also just think, kind of again looking at this entire situation regarding Joe Biden and who he's going to pick as his vice president, he has to pick somebody that can excite the base of the Democratic Party. That really and truly is important. And it's also important to remember Joe Biden would be the oldest president inaugurated on inaugural day. And he's also essentially picking the next leader of the Democratic Party. So this is different than most VP picks because it's not just your governing partner for 4 or 8 years. You've heard a lot of Democrats who are convinced Joe Biden is very likely only going to be a one-term president. So really, Joe Biden is laying out the course for the next decade in Democratic politics, and that's important to take into consideration as well.
I'm going to, our time, sadly, is rocketed by, and we just have a few minutes left. So I just want to pose a general question about the pandemic and what it's done to this race. And for that matter, the racial justice protests as well. They've put a spotlight on some of the systematic inequities and weaknesses of our society, of our economy. I'm thinking of things like access to healthcare, access to housing, fairness around the minimum wage, the exaggerated economic disparity that we have in this country, particularly around race. So my question is, and Kimberly, let me start with you. To what extent do you see these issues driving the presidential debate now in a way that they weren't doing so before the pandemic?
I mean, I think it's certainly going to be on voters' minds, and it's certainly something that can provide fodder for particularly the Biden campaign to really pay attention to and respond to. We've already seen that President Trump wants to retreat and go back to his 2016 playbook, but the impact of the 1-2 punch, of 1-2-3 punch, of these issues that are affecting not just Black Americans, but all poorer Americans. Again, the point that that extra $600 a month in unemployment insurance lifted people out of poverty. That's how poor they were before. It's not just Black people. And so people are feeling this in their pocketbooks. There's still a lot of uncertainty about when this pandemic will end. We are now talking about changing our systems, addressing a lot of the inequities that have already existed. The economy is unsure. It's not bouncing back in the way the president wants. And that's something, those are, I hate this term because it's overused, but the kitchen table issues that is on everyone's table right now. And Joe Biden needs to figure out how to break through and make the case that he's the person to fix it. And as the president digs in and thinks that the politics of grievance will carry him through.
Shermichael, I'd love to hear from you on this question as well. What Kimberly described as these kitchen table issues that could really drive a lot of this campaign.
Yeah. No, I think Kimberly is right, but I wouldn't overlook the president's odds. I mean, again, he has a very high approval within the Republican Party. He has raised a lot of money. The RNC continues to raise a lot of money. Having money enables one to target and outreach to new voters. And there are, according to data, new voters out there who are untapped, who are Trump-leaning voters that I think the Trump reelection campaign, from my understanding, they're working on targeting those specific voters in some of those key battleground states. And so while I think it's going to be challenging for him, I think his idea of going back to the things that got him there, I think it's smart. I think when you talk to a lot of Republican voters, they will point to very tangible things that they like about the president, things that they believe he has accomplished to their benefit. And I think if he hampers down on those things and say, I will continue to build upon those things, that is the best message, unfortunately, Anthony, that this president has. But again, I think to Joe Biden's ability to move forward and look forward, choosing the right person, creating a vision, as Joe talked about, that goes beyond just 4 years. I'm talking about a 10-year plan of this is the type of America that we want as Democrats. I think that's something that Joe Biden really needs to craft going into July and beyond to sort of give himself the necessary advantage that voters want to see in an alternative to President Trump.
Joel, I want to give the last thought to you in the minute or so that remains. But the same question that I put to Kimberly and Shermichael, the extent to which these issues that have been brought to the fore by the pandemic, by the racial justice movement, are having an influence on who the next president is going to be.
It reminds me, frankly, of 2008. Not all that dissimilar from when it was John McCain versus Barack Obama. We had an economic crisis that had exploded the country, and you knew whoever was going to be president was going to be taking over. And at that point, you had two challengers because Bush was term limited. But you had two challengers who were going to be vying for who would be best in place to lead the country out of a crisis. And I think that this moment is not all that dissimilar from this. I think what Trump's gift has been, and I say that term with some amount of regret, but his gift has been he is able to separate himself out from the standard DC politician playbook. And I think right now, Trump risks looking like just another Republican. And that's a real problem for him. If Trump can look like he is still a maverick, still an outsider who's going and trying to fix the system, because when people have, I'm convinced, if people have the opportunity to choose between static and change, all because we're in an era now where folks are so unhappy with their public officials, they're going to go change. If Trump is seen as the scion of the system, and if Biden is seen as change, Joe Biden will win. If Trump is able to hold that off, this is a 50-50 toss-up race.
Wow. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. You guys are all terrific. Thank you so much, Kimberly Atkins, Shermichael Singleton, and Joel Payne. And thank you, big thanks to the audience as well, especially those who submitted questions to this live stream and being a part of the conversation. For our last WBUR Town Hall of the season, Radio Boston host Tiziana Deering will discuss the myriad possibilities of what a post-pandemic society could look like. That happens next Tuesday, June 30th. Tiziana is going to be joined by Dr. Helen Boucher, Chief of the Division of Geographic Medicine and Infectious Diseases at Tufts Medical Center, Dr. Lynn Perry-Wooten, President of Simmons College, and Matthew Teitelbaum, Director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. You can register and find out how to submit your questions ahead of the event at wbur.org/events. Panelists, colleagues, friends, thank you again. Be well, stay safe, have a great evening.
You too.